This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please rate and review the podcast on podchaser.com or the Apple Podcast Store, and subscribe wherever you are listening. Please also consider nominating the podcast on the podcastawards.com People's Choice Podcast Awards. The podcast is in the religion and spirituality category. Again, we're doing this to get exposure, to have more people hear the podcast. Please consider doing that. It is a hang-up. You have to create a user and jump through a bunch of hoops, but I would really appreciate it if you could do that. I wanted to mention I will be on a podcast called the Steph Up Podcast. Stephanie interviewed me. She is a Christian who is in the middle of deconstructing a lot of things in her life, and she wanted to know about atheism. And it was a really fascinating conversation, and I highly recommend Stephanie's podcast, Steph Up, STEPHUP. My episode should be out on Monday, August 2nd. Mike T gets one more week off here, and we'll be back for next week's episode. On to today's show. My guest today is Geoffrey Wallis. Geoffrey has written a book called A Voice from Inside, Notes on Religious Trauma in a Captive Organization. Geoffrey describes himself as physically in and mentally out of the Jehovah's Witnesses, which means that he is still a member, he still is participatory, and yet he has completely deconstructed and deconverted. The reason for that, as he will go in this conversation, is the practice of shunning. And he points out that it is enforced shunning, that if he were to be either pushed out or to remove himself, not only would family members potentially shun him, but those family members would be pushed to shun him. And if they didn't do that, they would be shunned themselves, this double layer of shunning. His book is incredibly well written. It is also more than fair. He is not just attacking his former faith group, the Jehovah's Witnesses. He is doing so with empathy and sympathy and kindness, all the while also calling out the truth that needs to be said. Geoffrey talks about the need for protections for people who are disillusioned and no longer want to participate in a captive organization, and he'll go into the definition of captive organization in our conversation. I will have links in the show notes for Geoffrey's book. It will be out August 1st, which should be the first time you can hear this episode. His website is also Wallis Books, WALLIS books.com. You can get an example chapter from there as well. Here is my conversation with Geoffrey Wallis. Geoffrey Wallis, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thanks for having me on, David.
Really appreciate that you reached out to me. One of the things I've been interested in doing is getting people from different faith traditions on the podcast. It's been a little evangelical focused for a while. And you are a member of the Jehovah's Witness group, and you have written a book called
A Voice from Inside, Notes on Religious Trauma in a Captive Organization.
And I think what's maybe fascinating about this book and your story is that you are still in. You're still technically a member. Is that correct?
That's right.
And yet you've recognized some religious trauma in your life, and you've gone through some level of deconstruction.
Yeah. And, part of the reason for the title, A Voice from Inside, is kind of a reaction to George Chryside's textbook about Jehovah's Witnesses that he released in 2016, which is an excellent, thorough history, the most thorough I've ever read about Jehovah's Witnesses. But I felt that there was something just a little bit missing in terms of the experience of individuals who remain in the organization who may not still be thoroughly as devout as members of that organization appear on the outside. This
Right.
concept of individuals who are physically in but mentally out because of the captive policies of the organization. So the book was to sort of add a little bit to the understanding of Jehovah's Witnesses as a religion and of the personal experiences of people and where they are in their spiritual journeys.
On this podcast, I talk about trying to walk a fine line of calling out truth and yet also being loving and caring to the believers in our lives. And it's easy to just attack things, and it's harder to recognize the humanity and the reasons why we were a part of the organization, why we were a part of the religious groups, and maybe what let us out. But man, the introduction of your book is really kind. And you are really threading that needle of saying, these things need to be stated. These need to be publicized. But you are definitely not interested in just attacking your former group. Talk to me a little bit about how you went through that process of trying to decide to write the book.
Yeah. Well, and it's the tone that I have to take because of the love that I still have for, individuals, regardless of their faiths. And, it's why I appreciate the tone you take on your podcast too, because it's dealing with this fundamental difference, which could be polarizing and could divide people in a way that's graceful. So we can still show each other respect and foster humanist values. So in terms of me writing my book, it was sometime after I had gone through some of the worst parts of my religious trauma. So it was really just a personal project, was to write a book. But it did end up being about my trauma. Apparently I still had something to say that I needed to get out. So it ended up being the topic of the book. Yeah, so I really struggled. What tone am I going to take? A lot of the ex Jehovah's Witness literature, for understandable reasons, is a lot about getting some of the bitterness of the spiritual abuse, of the policing atmosphere, of the coercion, getting some of that bitterness out.
Yeah.
And so that is often the tone that is taken in ex witness literature, and I respect it. I really do. There's an important place for it, but that's not where I was. I was at a different place when I was writing the book, and this was more about, okay, now as a student of psychology and having been through mental health services, I think that it's very important for the academic community and as well as the therapeutic community to really understand what this looks like for individuals that are transitioning out of Jehovah's Witnesses or dealing with disillusionment in a closed religious organization. So that was the tone then that uh, I was trying to bring out in the book.
It seems more than fair from my perspective. I think you've just described what this podcast talks about a lot of first acknowledging that anger is an important part of maybe getting out of your religious trauma, of acknowledging feeling those emotions is grieving is all a natural part of this process. And yet at some point in time, you hope that you overcome that anger or come to some not living in that anger all the time. And I think that's just common for deconversion, deconstruction in general.
It really is. It's hard because for individuals who are deconstructing, we've been raised to think that anger is like, a work of the flesh, having
Right.
wrath as something that is of the devil, something that is bad. But when one is oppressed, the very natural response is anger. And anger can be then used to defend oneself or even in certain instances to aggress so as to maintain safety for oneself. So there's a place for anger. So it's again, it is an important part, and it is very important that individuals be heard, and that particularly in a therapeutic situation, that somebody can hold space for that anger and not
Right.
become defensive and not try and calm it down in a way that is unnatural before it's had its time to breathe. You have to let that anger breathe. But
Right.
on the other side is a place of peace, which I think we all attain regardless of the nature of our trauma, or that we seek to attain.
I wanted to go over just a few of the terms that you use because, again, they are graceful in the sense of not attacking terms. I like to acknowledge up front that as a former evangelicals were very prejudiced, very critical of anything that was not evangelical. But you use terms like captive organization, high demand religious group. I think high demand religious group is the one that I want to really focus on. But talk to me about the choice of those terms and what they mean.
Yeah, well, it's too easy to use words like cult, I think, and particularly, I didn't think that cult was going to sort of cut through the debate in the way that I wanted it to. Jehovah's Witnesses will turn off when they hear the word cult.
Right.
It was a conversation we had every day in the door-to-door ministry, right? When you're preaching with someone, they call you a cult, and you say, no, we're not a cult for these 5 to 10 reasons and scriptural arguments, etc. Yeah, so sociologists and social psychologists, they'll use new religious movement, or they'll use high demand religious group. And, there's a sort of subset of these closed or semi-closed groups. Church of Latter-day Saints is considered a
Sure.
new religious movement. High demand sort of implies a lot of social sacrifice in order to be one of the members, and then also activity requirements.
Okay.
So actual evangelical requirements that are sort of structured in the group. And so, yeah, that's why I chose to use that. I really wanted to get above that language and really address what was going on.
So you use the term physically in, mentally out. And I think that probably describes many people in many contexts. So people that are maybe not in as high a demand of religious groups, but also that people that are in high demand where the cost of leaving is so high, the shunning, the losing of family members, the losing of friends. So tell me what it means to be physically in and mentally out.
Yeah, well, that was something that I didn't even know existed, of course, until I started coming out from the illusionment of my religion. And so there's a controlled informational milieu as a Jehovah's Witness. You are taught that even higher education is from the devil, in the grasp of the devil, that there is apostate literature on the internet, and to turn away from that is poison, it's satanic. You're no match for the devil, don't even touch it, right? So I had never really researched Jehovah's Witnesses at all outside of the information that I was given from the organization itself. It wasn't until coming out that you start poking around on social media and you find this hashtag, PIMA. What is this? Physically in, mentally out. And it's just so illuminating. For me, it was very illuminating to think, wow, this really speaks to a condition. And it also speaks to the brokenness of the policy. The fact that there would be, so many, I don't know how many, that are in this situation, that they no longer believe in what the organization has to teach, but they are sort of stuck inside because of what they would lose upon exit. So, obviously, when somebody formally disassociates or is judicially removed from the group, then they are shunned by remaining members.
Mm.
And that shunning is enforced, which means even remaining members who perhaps would like to have conversations with ex members whom they love, they face shunning
Wow.
if they fail to shun. So it is this. I like to really make that distinction. It's not just shunning; it's enforced shunning based on the organization's role. So because of not wanting to leave family, loved ones, friends from childhood, many choose to figure out another way.
Okay.
And I certainly don't support that decision in any way. Or, I certainly don't support the arrangement. It is definitely a restriction on liberties, a restriction on freeness of speech for many, but it surely exists.
You begin the book with the discussion of a look into the sexual abuse in general by the Australian government. And they describe this idea of this captive organization. I'd love for you to expand upon what does that mean for an organization to be captive?
Yeah, well, that was such a fresh expression for me when I saw those first YouTube videos, because that was an accusation that I was not prepared for to defend.
Yeah.
But the prosecutor in that court case was really trying to help the member of the governing body who he was interviewing to understand how the social environment was captive. How, if one does not have the choice to leave, if you leave, you face shunning. And so you can either be disfellowshipped for doing something wrong and be shunned, or you can choose that you're not a Jehovah's Witness and then you still get shunned.
Yes.
So that makes it captive. That's when people say, "Well, I don't want to be a Jehovah's Witness, but I don't want to get shunned, so I just, I'm stuck." And
Right.
so there is this concept of fading into sort of non-existence. You just kind of go and slowly fade out of the organization, but it's still very much a restriction on. personal liberties, because if somebody is then seen disobeying the group's rules, even if it's very noticeable and notorious in the community, they can still be disfellowshipped. So that's what happens with disfellowshipping and shunning. And so, particularly in the Australian court, that had to do with the significance of that for individuals who had been victims of abuse, sexual abuse in the organization. To then also be subject to captive policies is just cruel.
Right.
And so the prosecutor was trying to help the organizational leader to really reckon with that. But he towed the line, or he repeated the line, which is no, if somebody chooses to leave, they're free to leave. But captive policies are really something that needs to be addressed, needs to be looked into, because of the significant danger to mental health and also suicidal ideation. When people are faced with this decision, do I speak about what is truest to me in terms of my faith and express myself, live a life that is mine? Or do I stay with my family and the ones that I love?
Hmm.
And that dichotomy there, the fact that policies lead to that situation is just makes this tremendously overbearing for many. And I do really think that makes depression, anxiety, religious trauma a greater risk. I know for myself, I went through a period of intense suicidal ideation that
Hmm.
I had to get mental health support to get past. And so I'm concerned about others that find themselves in that situation.
Absolutely. I think there's been quite a bit of criticism of religion in general in the United States, and the fact that we have freedom of religion, but what in practice often becomes the protection of religion. And when you're
Mm-hmm.
describing a captive organization under the umbrella of religion, that really comes into conflict with the separation of church and state.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular policy that you would like to see updated to handle these kinds of captive organizations?
Well, you do address the ethical conflict there. Whose rights are being protected. Is it the religious freedom of Jehovah's Witnesses, or is it the religious freedom of disillusioned Jehovah's Witnesses? Currently, the religious freedom of disillusioned Jehovah's Witnesses is not protected.
Right.
And so a lot of the legal discussion about shunning is that shunning is an expression of somebody's religious faith. If they choose because of their religion to shun somebody, then that right ought to be protected. But that really gets into a gray area when shunning is enforced by
Right.
the power dynamic of the group. So then the question is it truly an expression of religious faith if it is enforced and individuals don't have the freedom to choose not to shun? So you're in this cycle here. Yeah, I think that's something to look to when it comes to policy. And I'm not a legal expert by any means, but I do think that many have their right to practice religion or their right to abstain from practicing a religion violated by means of that policy.
And it is that kind of negative impression of the freedom from religion that I don't think we've nailed down the
Yeah.
legal framework to really protect that element. It's implied, kind of, but again, in practice, it feels like in the United States, religion is put on a pedestal and is seen as unassailable, and therefore great abuses of that power can go unchecked.
Yeah, and also as sort of more humanist values begin to grow and expand in the United States, there is more understanding of uh, sort of more flexible morals, moving away from Christianity. Now, fundamentalist Christian groups feel as if they're persecuted because they're getting a lot of information that is forcing them to think about their religious beliefs, and that is uncomfortable. And so it can feel at time. I know this feeling because I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, to where I feel like these new moral values are being forced down my throat, and that now I'm being persecuted
Right.
by the greater humanist movements of the world. And so I think because of that feeling that many have in conservative religious groups, then they push for religious freedom. So it seems as if legislation protecting religious freedom is for them. However, as you have rightly identified, it is within those very groups now that the violation of religious freedom happens. So,
Right.
yeah, you're right. We haven't dialed that in yet. We haven't
Yeah.
sort of figured that out for everybody.
Yeah. When I first went through deconversion, I was surprised at how many organizations were kind of focused on those ideas that, like CFI, Freedom from Religion Foundation, things that were focused on kind of the legal aspect, where it's like, that I didn't think of that as terribly important. But as time has gone on, I
Yeah.
realized these are really critical organizations to bring these things to light, that we
Mhm.
still have a lot to do to protect people who are disillusioned, who are no longer.
Yeah, because freedom of to express one's faith can be protected while the rights of others are protected.
Right.
There's, this is for example, shunning policies and Jehovah's Witnesses can be altered. There's a way to make a small adjustment, which would make the group much more progressive. You think about leadership and how scary that would be to sort of own up to this error in policy now when lives have been affected in very negative ways, perhaps even lives lost when it comes to suicide because of shunning, or when it comes to the loss of life because of refusing medicine with blood. How do you spin that to be what it normally is spun as, which is improved understanding from God?
Ah,
That is a difficult theological hoop to jump through, but it would be much more difficult for them to really own up and say, okay, we're just changing this because we think it's in everyone's best interest. But yeah, rights can be protected with a few small changes there to release the extremism, the extreme fabric of the organization. Then it can really undo some of these most negative aspects of conservative Christianity.
I'm curious for you personally. You've mentioned having some religious trauma experiences. So is it not kind of a continual trigger, if I can use that term,
Mm-hmm.
of experiencing this on an ongoing basis?
Yeah. At times it can be because now, if you choose, all of us are sort of at different stages in our sort of individualized expression too. So there may be times when, yeah, silence is comfortable. There may be no need to really press the bounds of one's social environment. But as one grows, there comes to be these moments where, okay, now if I'm going to step into myself, it's going to cause a rub. And so, definitely for me, remaining in brings me to these pivotal moments where, like, oh, now no longer can I be respectfully silent just simply by my movements. I'm showing that I believe differently.
Yeah.
And so that brings conflict. And for that reason, I know I don't know what the future is for me. There may be a time where I'm sort of muscled out,
Okay.
but in the meantime, I just try to make some space for myself and also do what I can to expand the minds of others, if not through words, simply through presence.
Again, I'm very concerned about protecting your anonymity. So let's talk in the generic. But I think of some of my close friends, and they knew in many ways before I did that I was
Mm-hmm.
on my way out.
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle that if a close confidant starts to recognize some signs that you aren't mentally in anymore?
Yeah, well, the fear runs thick, and the judicial atmosphere, the legalistic atmosphere, is an unspoken toxicity, which I think most Jehovah's Witnesses have not really reckoned with. Because if one reckons with the fact, I'm part of an organization with restrictive legalistic policies that restrict what I can be, I have to admit to myself that, yeah, maybe there's some things I'd like to do that I can't do. And if I did, I would face discipline. And so, because so many Jehovah's Witnesses are afraid to even go there with themselves, I know you're big on honesty, self
Yeah,
honesty.
yeah,
So, because they are unable to be honest with themselves, because of the implications of that, many step back from even having those difficult conversations. And it's a huge elephant in the room. But, for the most part, it's not pushed, at least. in terms of my experience. But I think a lot of this goes unspoken. Even for those who remain, they may come to some sort of peace with the oppressive environment that they live in. I'm talking about PMOs now, and then just not address it.
One of the things I found interesting in your writing was on your blog, you have a blog post called An Open Letter to the Governing Body of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I find it fascinating as an outsider because there's clearly insider language. You're using terms that within the Watchtower Society, they're all going to recognize those immediately. And to me, they sound really, really foreign. So,
Yeah.
so how is it that language is kind of a part of that high demand as well?
Yeah, and I try with most of my writing to really avoid some of that jargon, but in particular, that was it's directed to who it's directed to.
Right.
So I lent into it there because I know the impact of language, as you ask. This is one of Robert Lifton's criteria for thought control environments: is loading the language, is emotion laden language. So when certain phrases are used, then they trigger emotional responses. And when everybody is indoctrinated in the same theological understanding of scriptures, which I think happens in other religious groups, I'm not sure, but there is no open debate on personal interpretation of scripture. There is the official doctrine that everyone must subscribe to. So when a verse is used or a spiritual phrase is used, everybody knows exactly what that means. And they understand that this is where the conversation ends. And the organization has drawn the line in the sand here. There is no allowable thought beyond that.
Right.
And so language is definitely used to control. And it's also really important part of the recovery is to own that language back and also expand upon it and use vocabulary that will expand your cognition.
So one of the terms that I learned from that was being, I think it's raised in the truth. Is that right? So like being
Mm-hmm.
having parents
Mm-hmm.
who were Jehovah's Witnesses. We're kind of doing the story out of order here, but just a little bit. But what was it like growing up before you were having any doubts?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think doubt is very much a religious term, right? I think that surprisingly enough, when one releases belief, doubt goes away.
Yeah.
Questions remain, and curiosity remains, and ignorance remains, or lack of knowledge remains. But doubt is very much only in the presence of faith. It's only when
Right.
I've built my life around a belief, and when it seems in question, I therefore face this fear. It's actually a fear reaction. Doubt is that maybe I'm wrong, or
Mm.
maybe a lot of what I think is wrong. That's really what doubt is from an experiential point of view. So that happens, I think, with all religionists, and it certainly happened with me growing up. Periods of time where I had doubt about what I was believing, but you simply are in a closed environment where you deal with it. There's the unspoken repercussions of leaving. There is no being a halfway. You're either in or you're out.
Right.
So you just deal with the cognitive dissonance
Yeah.
and you work your way through the doubt. So what I felt was a fairly normal childhood, but there certainly were, as I came out of the indoctrination, you start to understand how toxic some of these beliefs are, and this is common among ex-evangelicals and ex-fundamentals in how some of this black and white thinking, some
Yeah.
of the restrictions on creative thought, on sexual expression, is really psychologically damaging.
Right.
So you don't understand the weight of that in your environment when you are in the bubble. But upon coming out, you really see how it's affected your entire life. And that's why, religious trauma is often lumped with complex PTSD, because in addition to the single event of loss of faith, which can be traumatic in itself as a single event, there are multiple events of traumatic shame, fear, the use of fear that accumulate over the years.
One of the surprises to me, I started the podcast to just talk about deconversion in the generic. And when people started to come on the show and tell their stories was the shock of how much trauma is out there, how much when your identity is tied up in a religious idealism and that starts to break down for you, that is devastating on every level of being a human being. That was surprising to me. That sounds naive, but I wasn't prepared for the depth of the stories.
Mm.
And I feel like I just continue to learn about how devastating this can be for people.
Yeah, and it's been really sort of encouraging for me as I came out on social media to see that this is affecting a lot of religious groups. Like
Yes.
in my mind, I assumed I was not alone, but then when you start speaking with people in social media, you realize, wow, there's some real parallels here. And I think that the extremeness of the environmental control contributes to the extremeness of the disillusionment. So to the extent that someone's entire social framework is wrapped up with a belief will make the deconstruction of it even more traumatic, because there's this concept of your tribe and losing all your social support in a very scary world. So but it exists obviously in Jehovah's Witnesses, but other very closed, very myopic communities where there's
Right.
only one style of thinking involved.
I had Alice Gretchen on, and she described a acting class that got very high demand. And so
Mm.
I think the other fascinating thing is that all you need is either a very charismatic leader or a set of rules, or where it's self-reinforced, and you can create that environment that becomes really, really toxic.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a couple models. Steve Hassan's bite model is really good for that, and also the one that I leverage in the book is Robert Lifton's 8 criteria for thought control environments, and I map that to the organization. It's important for people to understand what happens to individualized cognition when you're in those environments, and how there is the possibility of you losing it. This is the sort of creepy, scary, spine chilling thing about closed communities and cults, is that you can get lost, and only something very big will sort of shake you up and wake you up to it. But yeah, it's a reality in all instances of social control. Think about the person that you work with who is, for lack of a better expression, up the ass of your boss, because perhaps the leadership or authority role has used certain manipulative tactics to really get this person in their fold. And so these are ubiquitous human dynamics of power control.
I do want to circle back to what were some of the things that allowed you to see the toxicity, or to begin acknowledging, like you said earlier, you can't even admit to yourself. What were the things that allowed you to admit to yourself that you were questioning?
I had a little bit too much time, I think, to learn and read, and I had rejected opportunities for higher education when I was younger for the very reasons that I was told they were spiritually dangerous. But as part of my ministry, I was very interested in the religious groups that I was preaching to. And so part of convincing them the rightness of your argument is understanding their argument. And so that led me to dig deeper into other religious faiths
Mm-hmm.
and history of how religious faiths grow, and just started to realize, wow, this sounds a lot like me. There's really nothing special here,
Yeah.
which is okay. This is not a problem to realize that your faith is one of many and that there are similarities. But the problem with Jehovah's Witnesses is there is demonstrative impact on others for your belief. You subconsciously know that there is something offensive to others, something that hurts others when it comes to shunning, when it comes to disinformation. It's something that you're a part of subconsciously. And so when you stop believing that you are in fact the one group that somehow has this pass to
Right.
be manipulative or to shun others or to have prejudice, when you realize you're no longer the sole group with that carte blanche, now the guilt of what you're a part of sinks in. This is what makes it difficult for physically in, mentally out members. Is it's not just that they're deconstructing and leaving, but now they are at ethical conflict for staying.
Ah,
They feel a great pressure to speak out to other members or to right wrongs that they are seeing done in the organization. And so that's where you have that real conflict. And that's what happened with me. I realized, I'm no longer special. I'm no longer the one true, part of the one true religion of God. And now then, why am I doing this stuff that can harm people psychologically?
wow. I try to express often that generic Christianity, there's a myopia of just looking at the Gospels and any texts that refer back to the Gospels and never looking at kind of the human condition, the rest of human history, and that as soon as
Mm-hmm.
you step one step back and see that larger picture, as you say, you can no longer believe we are the one group who knows the truth and no one else does.
Yeah, and there's something to be said for empathy, and it is oftentimes what I've noticed among Jehovah's Witnesses. It's that empathy that really wakes them up. That they start seeing something from another perspective,
Yeah,
and that can happen usually with intimacy, right? When you really get to know someone, you feel a sense of intimacy and connectedness to them. That's when, all of a sudden you see the world through a different perspective, and you realize how others can be just as convinced in theirs as you are of yours. And that's what can really shake up the cognitive schema there.
exactly. The number one thing that I think you're conveying, something that I'm trying to convey, is that you're not alone, right? You can feel like you're the only one who is going through this, and everyone else has some direct connection to God that you don't feel, or that it's just not working for you. And that loneliness and that isolation is so, so devastating. So expand on that, but also what else do you want people to know who are maybe within the organization, who are just starting to ask some questions?
It's really hard for me to speak to that because you start to, once you get past your sort of dogged, or once I got past my dogged disbelief in God and sort of came to the terms that faith seems to be this common situation in humankind.
Yeah,
Yeah, reckoning with the fact that some people perhaps will always be faithful individuals. And when it comes to psychological balance, it may be a tool that they need to use.
right,
And so recognizing that some people will need a psychological tool to use to cope. If religion is in fact the opioid of the masses, well, then maybe some people need to use opioids to get by. And because of the difficulties of human existence, right? So when you start when I started balancing my view of that, then you start realizing, well, maybe I don't need to take it upon myself to shake and wake everybody.
right.
However, there is a threshold there for some when maintaining rigid belief is clearly creating some incongruence and psychological conflict, and then thus negative mental health outcomes, depression, anxiety. And this can be in a very restricted community. It could be simply the desire for creative expression. I see many who are depressed without knowing it, simply because they're not able to express the full range of their human emotions in a supportive environment. Or one could say they're not able to be vulnerable.
Yeah,
So for those ones, I hope that they listen to the truth of their personal experience. And I hope that they can have the courage to allow that to take them where they need to go. And that's an inferno, that religious trauma inferno, and they need support. And that's why it's very important for others to offer that support, to give them the freedom to draw that line where they choose to draw it, and just support them in whatever they choose.
and then you can answer this as generically. It doesn't have to be about you personally, but what practices or sources do you find useful now to bring meaning and healthy human experiences for yourself?
I use a lot of meditation practices. So I read a lot of Sam Harris's work, and others like Aldous Huxley as I was sort of
Mhm.
coming out of my indoctrination. And this understanding that spiritual experiences can be very therapeutic to the mind and also don't require an oppressive God or even a God at all. One can benefit from these altered states of consciousness. And so I found that exploring altered states of consciousness through Buddhist and Taoist meditation has allowed me to sort of break apart these crusty old schemas in my mind. And part of Taoist meditation is about identifying categorized thinking. So if you see black and you see white, well, then you break it apart and you create a spectrum of gray. Or if you see good and you see bad, well, you break it apart and you create a new spectrum. And that's inserting entropy into the mind. And that shakes out into a much more balanced psychological state where you can undo some of your compulsive thinking and you can also undo your obsessions. So that has been very helpful for me. Learning about psychology, individualist psychology, helped me significantly to listen to my own voice rather than the collective voice and prioritizing my personal experience as opposed to the group as a whole.
My one story of a friend who was Jehovah's Witness. I was definitely the bad guy in this story. I was full blown evangelical at the time, but I had a friend of mine who was an ex Jehovah's Witness, and to the best of my knowledge, I believe he had been disassociated. But what struck me in our conversations, as I was again the bad guy trying to win him, win him over at the time, was just how committed he still was to Jehovah's Witnesses in general. And one example of that was we were talking about what often evangelicals and Jehovah's Witnesses debate about is which version of the Bible is correct. And here's a guy who was out, who definitely not a believer in it anymore, and still was defending the organization and saying, well, why would they spend so much time and energy to have these translators? And I trust them. So it's fascinating, that conversation. I will always remember that conversation, in that he was still very much defending the organization. Do you feel like that is just indicative of how deep the commitment to the organization is, or how how difficult it is to truly break free?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes beyond religion at that point. It goes deeper. It goes to our very biological roots of connecting with a tribe of people. And Jonathan Haidt talks about this in his book, The Righteous Mind.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about this hive mentality that comes when groups of individuals are really in the trenches together and they work at a common goal of great importance. And he quotes individuals who have had a part in the military. And when they do group routines and they do activities together, movements together, which are very similar to religious rites of movement together, a sort of hive like mentality comes about, but also a sort of transcendence comes about. It is very much a spiritual experience.
Mm,
And so, even in the absence of theology, that intense social camaraderie becomes a spiritual experience.
right.
And so the depths of that loyalty to your people remain, and they remain with me because the individuals, you still very much love them. You still have something culturally similar. That's something you have to realize. Even though Jehovah's Witnesses are rubbing arms with you at the grocery store, their culture is profoundly different than yours.
Right.
And so Jehovah's Witnesses, they speak to each other. They have some immediate intimacy. They have immediate common ground. They understand the way each other thinks. So even as one moves away from this, starts to learn more about other cultures and other ways of thinking, there's still that brotherhood that exists.
Yeah.
And so that can have something to do with feeling the need to defend Jehovah's Witnesses and say, oh, well, they're not all that bad and all this and that, which of course, they are humans too,
Yeah.
subject to the same human psychology as we all are. But yeah, that's why in my book, I can't speak negatively,
Right.
and still in a sense, there's that a little bit of kinship there. and perhaps there always will be, frankly,
Yeah.
even though I cannot support the mission of the organization any longer.
Let's spend a little bit of time plugging the book. Take us through a summary of what you're trying to get across in the book.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of memoir, just because that's the information I had about religious trauma was my personal experience.
Sure.
But it also talks about the history of the organization, particularly when it comes to psychological and procedural captivity. So just a micro focus version of the history of the organization in how they became closed, how they developed policies that affect the psychological captivity of members, and also the disfellowshipping and the hardcore insider-outsider mentality that exists. So there's a little bit about that in the book, and then there's also Lifton's 8 criteria and mapping that to the organization. And then there's a little bit about using meditation and understanding social psychology to undo the influence of societal thinking on your own. So part of all this for me was not only just releasing myself from an oppressive environment and running into a new one or getting lost in something else, but was to figure out how to listen to myself again.
Mm.
So the dangers of social influence, social polarization. I talk a little bit about Solomon Asch's studies, and also Sergei Moscovici's minority influence studies on how to create change in the minds of others through a determined and persistent stance of confidence.
Okay.
Is also was fascinating for me, and also sort of helps me get by on the day-to-day as a PMO sometimes.
So how can people find your book? I understand it's coming out here very quickly. I think actually when we release this episode, it will probably be out, but tell people how they can get the book.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. August 1st, it's available on Amazon. So you'll be able to get it there, the EPUB and also the paperback. And we're recording an audiobook now too. So you'll be able to get that through Audible and everywhere else you download audiobooks.
Awesome. I think your voice is an extremely important one in that, just as we talked about your open letter, you understand that language, you can use that language to convey a mental freedom, right? That there's something beyond that captivity, and someone like myself would never be able to speak into those people's lives. So I think it's really important what you are doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, Geoffrey, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate this. I will have links in the show notes for your book and do everything we can to publicize it.
Awesome. Thanks, David. I really appreciate being able to chat with you today. It was great.
Final thoughts on the episode. I've now been doing the podcast for approximately 2.5 years, and very few people that I have interacted with I would consider experts on deconstruction, deconversion. I would put Geoffrey in that category. The book is detailed. It touches on high demand religious groups or cults. It touches on thought control. It touches on the reasons that people stay, why they would be committed to remaining. It is incredibly well written. It is called A Voice from Inside, Notes on Religious Trauma and a Captive Organization. Again, you can get a chapter from wallisbooks.com, WALLIS books.com, as well as the book should be out now on August 1st and available on Amazon. I will have links in the show notes. There was so much in that conversation that was amazing. The number one thing I want to pull out here is how kind and empathetic Geoffrey is. As has been stated many times on the podcast, there tends to be a very hard edge in the atheist community that is incredibly disrespectful of religion and religionists. Geoffrey takes that middle ground of calling out the truth while also showing kindness, care, and empathy for the people who remain. I honestly don't know how he does it, having experienced religious trauma himself, how he remains within that system. My paltry few visits to church after deconversion were uncomfortable at best, and so I can't imagine being deeply immersed in a culture you no longer agree with. A couple of things that Geoffrey said that I thought were really interesting. He talked about the extremeness of the environmental control contributing to the extremeness of the disillusionment. And to the extent that someone's entire social framework is wrapped up in belief will make the deconstruction of it even more traumatic. You might be listening to Geoffrey and think, wow, that sounds like my church, or that sounds like my group, my organization. Or you might be thinking, wow, that sounds really extreme. But here's the thing that we should recognize is that manipulation and control can be very, very subtle. And when you begin to recognize that you are in a very controlling, high demand group, the number one thing is for you to be honest with yourself. We talked about that. Geoffrey's talked about people being almost unable to be honest with themselves because of the consequences. But internally, being able to be honest with yourself about what you believe and what you don't for your own personal mental health. I'd also highly recommend Recovering from Religion. That is recoveringfromreligion.org. You can actually chat with somebody. You can talk through these things with them in privacy. One more thing that Geoffrey said is that it is really empathy that wakes them up. They start seeing things from a different perspective. He also talked about the myopia. Definitely, I see that in regular old Christianity. We focus only on the things that support Christianity and not on anything that would suggest otherwise. My great suggestion to all doubters is just take one step back. Look at the bigger picture. Look at the story of humanity. Look at comparative religions. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And if there are similarities, what does that mean? And lastly, I also really appreciated that Geoffrey doesn't see his job as fixing everyone or breaking everyone out. He used the term shake and wake. Again, this is my diagnosis of the problems with secular social media is we often take it as our job to dissuade people of their faith. And I don't think that is necessary or useful. It's not helpful. Rather, we should have empathy. And for those of us who have gone through deconversion and deconstruction, that should be pretty easy. Remember what it felt like. How convinced were you? Instead of seeing that person as someone to be argued with and forcibly change their mind, see them as a human being who's doing the best they can with the tools they have available to them. I want to thank Geoffrey for being on the podcast, for sharing his wisdom and research, and an incredible story of being inside a captive organization and living to tell the tale. Geoffrey, thank you so much for being on the podcast. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is accepting yourself. Last week I referred to an article by Tris Malone talking about self-grace, but I want to tie this into Geoffrey's story. Part of the vicious cycle that flavors of Christianity, but religion in general, have is denying our humanity, saying that our human foibles make us evil and bad, and that the only solution is commitment to an organization, to a deity, to a set of spiritual disciplines, to an ancient text, to an archaic form of morality. All of which feed back to us that we don't live up to those things and that it must be us that's wrong. So the secular grace idea here is to be honest with yourself and be forgiving of yourself, especially if you find yourself in a high-demand religious group. Ask yourself, is this common to all people, to all human beings? And if it is, why does my religious group say it's bad and evil? If it's just a part of being a normal human being, be willing to accept your own humanity and be okay with that. I've written an article called "You Are Not Broken, You Are Human." And so much of religion and Christianity specifically says that you are broken, that you are a sinner, that your righteousness is as filthy rags. And none of that is true. You're just a human being, just like everyone else. we're all trying to get through. And as Geoffrey said, many people will decide that a spiritual, supernatural framework is the tool they need to be psychologically healthy. And that's okay too. But being willing to acknowledge when you do believe, when you don't believe, being honest with yourself and accepting of yourself is going to bring you much greater mental health in the long run. I'm going to put in one more plug for the People's Choice Podcast Awards at podcastawards.com. The Graceful Atheist podcast is in the religion and spirituality category. Please nominate the podcast, and then in the month of August, the voting will begin. And again, this is for exposure. I'm hoping more people will hear about the podcast. We've got lots of interviews that have been done and lined up. So until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.